Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Rob Greenwood, Executive Director of Public Engagement and the Harris Center at Memorial University, and delighted to be here at the Stone Jug in Carbonear, Newfoundland. We're webcasting live, so we could have viewers anywhere in Newfoundland and Labrador, across Canada, or around the world. And around the world is particularly relevant here today because we have colleagues from an organization. Its acronym is RETI. That's a French acronym. And it's an organization of international island universities. And Memorial University has been hosting a conference over the last few days. And this is our field trip day. And because public engagement is such a central part of what Memorial is all about, we wanted to make sure that we had a field trip that involved some of our partners in Newfoundland and Labrador. We all got on the bus this morning and went out to Holyrood initially and had a great session with people from the Marine Institute and the town of Holyrood about the partnership with Memorial there with the Holyrood Marine Base. And then we wanted to come out to the Stone Jug in Carbonear. We have a bunch of organizations we partner with in this region and are delighted to see a bunch of colleagues and partners and citizens from the Bay de Verde Peninsula. My mom is a Bercy from Old Perlican, so I'm always glad to come out in this neck of the woods. In terms of the RETI network, we have people attending our conference from the location of the conference last year in Okinawa in Japan. We have colleagues from the Canary Islands who will be hosting the conference next year. It's a great group to become a part of. We also have people here from the Cayman Islands, from Corsica, from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, from Taiwan, from Prince Edward Island, and of course from Newfoundland. I think I got all the islands. Did I? Oh, which island did I miss? Oh my heavens, the Canary Island. Oh no, I did mention Canary because you have to pay attention all the time. But absolutely, and this is going to be an interactive session. We have a superb panel. What we will do is discuss, of course, island tourism, and we will have some panel discussion, followed by a Q&A with people here in the room, as well as people who can email in questions on the web. We have a superb panel. We have Jerry Byrne, who his greatest claim to fame is he is a former member of the Harris Center Advisory Board. I noticed, Jerry, it's not actually in your bio, so I'll be editing that. Jerry is no stranger to most people in Newfoundland and Labrador. He's been accused of being a serial entrepreneur. His bio actually says he's a serial something. We don't want to explore that any deeper. He has been on numerous boards, both private and public sector. He has won numerous awards, both personally and for the companies he created. And he literally is a serial entrepreneur. He has created, founded, harvested numerous firms. He was inducted in the Atlantic Business Top 50 CEO Hall of Fame after being selected as one of Atlantic Business's top 50 CEOs 5 years in a row. So when it comes to making a business work, Jerry knows how to do it. And he's doing that currently in this region. He is currently co-owner, operator of the award-winning Doctor's House Inn and Spa and the Dildo Dory Grill and Ocean Delight Cottages in Whiteway and Heart's Delight, Islington. And for many of our visitors, if you haven't yet learned to appreciate place names in Newfoundland, there is a town called Dildo on the other side of the peninsula. And it is ironically in Conception Bay. And for people who don't have the utility in English, we can elaborate further on the bus later. There are also 3 beautifully named towns, one Heart's Delight, Heart's Desire, and Heart's Content. So Newfoundlanders in a rough environment learn to appreciate this environment, and we'll hear more about that, I think, as its connections with tourism. Jerry is past chair of the Tourism Destination Management Organization of Eastern Newfoundland. Next to Jerry is Jane Severs. She is the executive director of the Association of Heritage Industries Newfoundland and Labrador, AHI, which is an umbrella organization of provincial heritage groups encompassing museums, archives, archaeology, genealogy, built and intangible heritage, and more. Collectively, its members represent more than 2,000 organizations, institutions, and individuals involved in heritage activity throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. Since 2014, Jane has also served on the board of directors of the Colony of Avalon Foundation in Ferryland, one of the province's anchor heritage attractions, and institutions. And finally, from Memorial University, I didn't know, Mark, your middle initials were CJ. We'll probably play on that in the future. Mark C.J. Stoddard, sounds like a DJ, is an associate professor in the sociology department at Memorial University. His research examines the potential benefits and challenges of tourism development for social ecological well-being of host communities. He is currently the principal investigator of the major project, the Oil Tourism Interface and Social Ecological Change in the North Atlantic. Through a comparative analysis of Denmark, Iceland, Newfoundland, Labrador, Norway, and Scotland, this project offers valuable lessons for how coastal societies can better navigate relationships between resource extraction and tourism. His work has appeared in an extensive range of international and Canadian sociology and environmental social science journals. So thank you, Mark, for joining us. I think he was saying on his resume these days, there's probably 14 Harris Center events. 13 or 14. So we're thinking about creating a Harris Center Fellow designation. I think Mark's a slam dunk. So we have a great combination of research and experience at the table, as well as in the room. I'm going to start with an opening question for all three panelists to let us know, in addition to those short little bios, maybe starting with Jerry, what is your interest, experience as relates to tourism, in particular small island tourism, how that relates to the work that you do? And your mic is for the online viewers, so we do need to project for the people in the room.
Welcome everybody, especially people from Malvern, Canary Island, Corsica, Japan, and all around the world. Welcome to Newfoundland and Labrador and out in Conception Bay. I'm an old guy. Luckily in the room there's one person maybe older than me. I think born slave. Two pioneers. And especially Kathy Stacy, who is the CEO of our conservation management. Government. I'm going to talk about the way down the road. What's also special about some of these places in our area, we also have, in addition to Cuba, we have sunlight champs and split eagle and side pond and bunch of, we have the whole range of names. But I retired from the industrial sector, oil and gas, construction, so I came out area for a week and felt absolutely to a point where we decided to stay and saw the opportunity. And well, I'll say I'm focused the best I can. I have anything of flavor. I'm grown. Yeah, so started off in the high pressure oil and gas sector. Oh,
for some reason this microphone is not working.
Oh, okay. That works now? Okay. So yeah, I came from a pretty high pressure industry, oil and gas, construction, and came out for a weekend after I retired for the second time. And said to my wife at the time that we can't leave here. I'm going to have to find some kind of a business around this thing because this is spectacular. What a place for place to relax, to get away from it all. And so we ended up talking to the guy and selling us the cottages in Whiteway and in Heart's Delight. Then the following year, there was a large, beautiful property that the owners wanted to sell, approached us and said, would you like to buy this property, which is like 140 acres on the ocean, a couple thousand feet with goats and sheep and pigs and ducks and chickens. And by magazine, Canada's magazine, as #2 must-see destinations in the world. And so fell in love with it. It took us about a year to put it together. and it took off from there. And then the following couple of years later, we end up buying the Dildo Dory Grill up in Dildo, which is next community. So in the 4 communities side by side, we have a business operation in tourism. Last year, we had at least 11,000 paying customers in all the, well, actually more than that now, probably 14,000 last year. The year before, 11,000. There we peaked at 65 employees, about 45 will get government programs over the winter. Our increase in revenues over year 1 have been in excess of 1,200%. And we think we've been a catalyst for a lot of other things in the Trinity Bay side of the area. Since in the last few years since we started, we really think we were a catalyst. We've had 7 British weddings, 4 Irish weddings, Israeli weddings, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, United States. Our average wedding is about 140 people, and at present time we can only put about 30 to bed. So we filled up B&Bs and venues up and down the shore. A lot more got created. Then we had last summer the Dildo Brewing Company got started up, and it's been a true catalyst in every respect of the word. As a result, now we have all kinds of Airbnbs and Boathouse Cafe in Dildo, Woodhaven Cottages. We have strategic alliances with multiple companies up and down the shore. So our situation now is we're starting to expand our seasons via corporate offerings, because weddings tend to be summer centric and weekend centric. Corporates tend to be fall and spring centric and weekday centric. So it's a really good match for us. It's been a quantum over the last few years. So anyway, and what we're doing right now is we're adding another 12 suites as we speak. So, like Rob said, how much more time we got, Rob? Not
About 30 seconds.
Okay, I'm going to say that in about 30 seconds. I said, like Rob said, I am a serial entrepreneur. I've started many companies, locally, nationally, and internationally. I took the previous company from 16 employees and $1 million a year to more like 450 employees and 90 million in about 7 years. Then I retired. And I can say after all those years and all the hard work, I've never been in an industry as challenging, as difficult, and with as much potential as this tourism industry. It is a real challenge, no question about it.
Thank you, Jerry. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about geography. Dildo is actually probably in Trinity Bay, isn't it? That's shocking. It ruins that joke, though. So I think I'll keep saying it's in. Jane, over to you.
So as Rob said, I work with the Association of Heritage Industries, Newfoundland and Labrador. And so not surprisingly, my interest lies in the intersection of tourism and heritage. And there's absolutely no doubt that tourism and heritage provide mutual benefits to one another. In Statistics Canada's most recent survey of Canada's heritage organizations, museums, archives, historic sites, and heritage attractions in this province attracted just over 1,094,000 visits in 2016. And those visits generated 7 million in direct revenues for those organizations. And that's absolutely fantastic. But the most pressing concern for heritage organizations in this province is the increasing conflation of tourism and heritage. And tourism and heritage are not the same thing. And I'll just expand on that in a little bit. In my little world, heritage is defined as anything that a community deems important enough to preserve for the future. So using that definition, heritage is both product, it's the stuff that we decide we want to preserve, but it's also a process. It's conversations, it's debates, it's investigation and research that support those conversations. And so heritage requires community. It requires community, it requires community engagement. In contrast, tourism requires tourists. And so if you just stop and think about this, what happens if you're a community and you're located off the beaten track and you're difficult to access? What happens if the heritage that you want to preserve represents minority or marginalized groups? What happens if the heritage that you're trying to preserve commemorates or remembers difficult, challenging, unpleasant, controversial issues. None of those things are going to have mass market appeal. So in a world where policy and public funding is tied to tourism, what does that mean for communities that preserve those types of heritage? And if we define heritage as our ability to determine what we want to preserve for future generations, what does that say about our society if we turn that decision-making process over to the market economy? And so that, in a nutshell, is the kind of stuff that keeps us heritage nerds awake at night.
Thank you, Jane. Well, Mark, a little overview, your interest, experience in all this.
Yes, thank you, Rob, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So I originally came to Memorial University, to Newfoundland and Labrador, about going on 9 years ago now, from graduate work in British Columbia. And so my PhD work was actually all around the social and ecological dimensions of the ski industry in BC, which is a core part of their tourism sector, of course. And so when I relocated here, started thinking about kind of relocalizing my research program here, and became very interested in the ways that the kind of emerging tourism sector here, which I think is safe, at least compared to British Columbia, felt like it was very much still emerging, especially almost 10 years ago. How it's maybe changing the ways that people think about living in coastal communities, coastal environments, and then also as an environmental sociologist by training, where my main interest in tourism lies is how tourism can be leveraged by host communities to contribute to social and ecological well-being, right? To create sustainable development pathways for communities. So I certainly don't come at it as a tourism business scholar, a tourism management scholar, much more as a sociologist who's interested in the cultural, social, environmental dimensions of tourism and how it might be used to contribute to well-being. And that's meant in the last several years working throughout the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, so the island portion of Newfoundland, but also a couple of smaller islands. So actually, I'll also invoke Gordon Slade here. About 5 years ago, got me connected to Battle Harbour, a very, very small island off the shores of Labrador. You can basically walk the circumference of in about half an hour. So probably the smallest small island I've done tourism-oriented research on, but also working recently on similar issues around Fogo Island with my colleague Natalie Slawinski in the Faculty of Business at Memorial, who's leading some of that work. That's been very interesting. In the last couple of years, I've started to think a bit more comparatively across the North Atlantic, as Rob alluded to with my my current main project. So thinking about how coastal societies, coastal communities navigate this relationship between resource extraction economies, most notably the oil and gas sector, probably the big one in this region, with tourism economies that are often based on kind of images of nature and this kind of experience of kind of whale watching, puffins, and this kind of undisturbed nature kind of imagery, right? So many of you I know are from warm islands, where the problems of tourism are most often problems of over-tourism, of too many people, of not having a slow season. I think is much more common in the warm island part of the world. But in the North Atlantic and the cold island parts of the world, there are often problems of how to get people in, right? How to kind of generate more traffic. And as I spend time in the last few years, also in small island settings in northern Norway and in Iceland as well, kind of been working there, they tend to be similar problems to hear of, like, well, how do you get people to come? And then sometimes you have a problem like Iceland now, where it's booming so fast that they're starting to see some of those over-tourism problems. So I guess as a sociologist, I'm particularly interested in, how do you make it sustainable for communities? How do you get enough people in to make it a viable industry for community sustainability without seeing some of those issues of over-tourism with some of the negative social and ecological impacts? So yeah, a bit of what I've been up to and occupying my brain space with for the last several years. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So you can see we have a very well qualified and diverse panel. So Jerry, a little more time for you this time. 6 or 7 minutes. Yeah. If you need. How does the business of being located on an island impact your business and your experience with all this?
I thought you were going to ask me that question, Rob. I may have some.
Well, I'm
No,
glad you're
yeah.
prepared, Jerry. You're just telepathic.
Well, I know. What can I say? Yeah.
We've known each other too long.
I would love to have the problem of over tourism. Oh my God, what a beautiful problem to have. Oh, geez, bring it on. But I think you addressed some of them from a business perspective. What I see are some of the challenges are that we're an island out in the North Atlantic where it's enough to blow the head off you almost every single day. Peak season is about 60 days. If you're lucky, you got about 90 days and pushing to 100 days. And so for a typical tourism operator, it's a challenge from the very short season because you got to operate 12 months of the year for all intents and purposes, but only receiving money for 90 to 100 days. Real challenge. I'm speaking strictly from a business perspective because that's my background, 40 years and plus in business. So, and some of the things about Newfoundland is it's a not a place you do a day trip to. Newfoundland is one of these places where you have to plan it, you have to organize it, and I'll get down on the negative side of the other side of that coin in a few minutes. But it's a very costly place. The ferry costs a fortune. It's slow. It takes you a long while to get here. Air takes about 75% of the people come here by air, and then you have the problem with in peak season with cars, rentals, and things of that nature because all of a sudden these companies have to operate. Not all of a sudden they have to operate 12 months of the year. And all of a sudden there's a surge in the summer and they just don't have enough vehicles to be able to warrant having enough cars for everybody. Those are the problems that we have with the short season. And the small population is a big problem spread out over a huge area, 500,000 people over 150,000 miles, square miles. It's incredible. We're as big as Newfoundland, as Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick and PEI combined times 3. And so the infrastructure costs are horrendous. And the province is saddled with enormous debt. A lot of challenges that way. Some of the government programs can be your friend and your enemy at the same time. Like employment insurance can be a real boon, but it also can be a real cost to businesses like ourselves. And I'll talk about that after. And every negative is amplified by the fact you're outside the city, where you have that congestion of people. The other side of that is once you get outside the city, there's not a lot of things to do. So it becomes even more problematic for a province. And the list goes on. Now, for those negatives, right, I usually see negatives as opportunities. So, yeah, the other side of that coin is that we are an island out in the middle of the North Atlantic where we blow the head off you every day. That's the plus in a lot of ways. You don't, like I said, you don't have to plan a day trip to Newfoundland because the average stay, the plus is it's average, 12, 14 days the average stay because when you're coming here, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So you're going to try to get the maximum bang for your buck. So, and so the other thing too is that people coming here are typically 60% of the people are 55 plus and usually just couples. So, there's an advantage to that because they spent their whole life saving up money to be able to afford to come here in a lot of cases. Right? So they usually have a fair number of dollars to spend once they get here. So you can turn that into an asset depending on the kind of business you are. If you think about it and strategize it. I have a basic philosophy: think a nice bit, plan a little bit more, and then do a lot more. So it's think, plan, and do. But the key in surviving from a business perspective in a place with those challenges is the partnering effect. There's a lot of ACOA. People who don't know ACOA, it's a thing that's called Atlantic Canada's Opportunity Agency. And like American Express says, don't leave home without it. My opinion is don't start a business without ACOA. Don't leave home without ACOA. Same with another great partner is the CBDC, which is another sort of a government-funded agency. A fantastic partner for doing businesses, and not only to help you get started, but they'll mentor you all the way through. It's really good for new people getting in business. I've been in it for 40 plus years, so I don't need a lot of mentoring, but I do appreciate the help that we get from people like Diane Hodgebert at the CBDC. The province, numerous programs, and even with their limited budgets, they're there to help where they can. The federal government as well. I mean, nobody knows better than Gordon Slade, who used to be the president of ACOA. Was that the president you were? Vice president, close enough. But for many, many years. And those programs are instrumental and absolutely critical in environments like Newfoundland and Labrador, out in the cold North Atlantic. Business Development Choice, the Business Development Bank, I mean, of Canada, BDC, is another absolute necessity because, not to confuse it with commercial banks, because in my opinion, the single biggest impediment to small business in Newfoundland and Labrador are commercial banks. And so thank God you have places like the Business Development Bank of Canada to turn to take a risk with you that the commercial banks will not even consider in most cases. So they are, in my opinion, the first go-to if you're trying to start up a business. And they're there to help you, teach you, mentor you. The other big partners you have are all your associated businesses. I don't consider any of the companies in our area to be a competitor. I consider them to be a complementer because we're all in together. So if you take that approach and you try to help all your other businesses succeed, you cannot help but succeed yourself. That's how it works in a small place in Newfoundland and Labrador. And then, of course, we have all the non-for-profits, like Jane has been really talking about. These are an instrumental part of the whole package. We had people who came down from Ontario the first year, music to my ears. The guy says, I come down from Toronto. He says, I got bagfuls of money and nowhere to spend it. I said, well, I see I can change that for you. We'll find a way to take that money out of your pocket if we possibly can. So, and these are all partners. And as long as we take that into consideration and use the guiding techniques and the strategies with the destination management organizations, which are strongly funded by COA and the province, we put all this stuff together and we can create some kind of an identity that allows us to take advantage of the new focus for Newfoundland and Labrador, which was to create a tourism industry in the absence of the fishing industry as it collapsed around us. And so the Vision 2020, which was the government's vision back about 8 or 10 years ago, was to generate about $1 billion in tourism in Newfoundland and Labrador. So this year, we'll actually exceed that, and we will actually outstrip the fishing industry for generating revenues for the province. So you can turn to all these organizations, and especially people like the university, the Harvard Center, all these organizations that are there to help people who don't have that business acumen to thrive and to succeed and thrive in a place like this. So same with the Harvard University and the College of North Atlantic. Not only do they have these programs, but they have these students and the student programs. And all these things can be put together in the right kind of a package to make you successful. But it does take a lot of planning. It does take a lot of thought, and so on. So let me see, where else am I?
Maybe in 30 seconds or
so.
so.
Yeah. So no, those are the opportunities. There's always threats, but if you think about it long enough, hard enough, and you do your SWOT analysis, you'll find a way to survive even in the harshest environments.
Super. Thank you, Jerry. Jane, from your perspective with Heritage Industries, and again, in terms of being located on an island, your thoughts on all that, 6 or 7 minutes.
As I mentioned earlier, there's absolutely no doubt that heritage and tourism provide opportunities for each other. And if we look at the revenue mix for heritage organizations as a whole in this province, between 40 and 60% of their total operating budgets are derived from visitor revenues. So it's essentially the vast majority of heritage organizations in this province could not get by without the revenues they generate from tourists. But the other thing that's important to recognize is that Jerry talked about the increasing tourism revenues that the province is generating, that those revenues are not equally distributed right across the province. And that I don't know the exact statistical breakdown, but if you look at it, the vast majority of that revenue is being earned on the Northeast Avalon and also in tourism hotspots like the Bonavista Peninsula and around the Gros Morne area. And again, if you're a heritage organization that's operating in rural Newfoundland outside those revenues, the benefits that you're seeing from tourism reduced dramatically. So what we tell heritage organizations is that you have to cultivate your tourism audience. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But you also have to cultivate what we call a family. And so your family often are people who may never visit your site, but they support you because they connect with your mission, and they appreciate the impact that you have on heritage, but also on your communities as a whole. And um, that's especially important in on island communities and in rural communities, because, as I said, on many occasions, your family members do not have to ever visit your site. They can be anywhere in the world. And family members provide donations in terms of cash and in-kind contributions. If they're located near you, then they often provide you with volunteer hours. They are advocates and champions on your behalf. They also provide earned media in terms of positive word of mouth and on social media posts. So, and all of those contributions have real tangible benefits to the bottom line of an organization. And there's plenty of research out there that shows that organizations that deliver on mission and provide community impact outperform financially organizations that market themselves primarily as tourist attractions. So again, because I think I was invited as the contrarian on this panel, one of the concerns that the heritage community has with this increasing conflation of tourism and heritage is that it not only affects the kind of heritage that is preserved and presented and promoted, but it also impacts the bottom line of the organizations that are doing this work.
Super. Thank you, Jane. And Mark, and I should note, Mark brought copies of a paper he did with Harris Center support on regional tourism networks and social environmental well-being in rural coastal communities. There are copies here in the room at the back, and they are on the Harris Center website for anybody who wants to get one who isn't in the room. Great. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll also just note that both of the Harris Center projects that I've run over the years, the reports are also up on myacademia.edu page, as well as the Harris Center website for anybody listening at home or in the room who didn't snag one there. So I guess I would say maybe 3 main points, if I can. Rob can cut me off. And probably following a little bit from Jane's comments, so I'm a sociologist, and if you know sociologists, you know we're basically professionally trained to be cynics. Sociologists are kind of socialized professionally to find the bad in everything. But I think, it often means also having a more nuanced view. So within the world of tourism research and public debate about tourism, I think we often have this very polarized idea, especially in kind of rural and coastal societies, that on one hand, it's going to be kind of the panacea that saves everything, that it's going to kind of completely revitalize a community, that it'll kind of solve all the problems. On the other hand, that all it really does is museumify communities. It Disneyfies them. It turns them into kind of seasonal places or enclaves of wealthy outsiders, and that it's a force for destroying community. I would say several years of doing this now, I tend to fall somewhere very much in between, and I think there are positives and negatives, which I think means that we need to pay much more attention to how tourism is managed, right? Issues of tourism governance, because how communities take advantage of the positives and mitigate the potential negative impacts is going to be through proactive governance, not being reactive, through kind of better community engagement. So to just break down in really brief, I think what I would see is some of the positives and negatives that have come out of the work that I've done. It's like, well, from the economic perspective, which is what a lot of us probably think of first, well, certainly employment. And on the plus side, one thing that's nice about tourism employment, or very valuable about it, is it's more diffuse than a lot of resource sector employment, right? It's not as concentrated in a couple particular places. It reaches out into a wider breadth of communities, often, especially to more rural and remote communities that may not see the benefits of resource extraction economies, right? So that can be one of the really economically beneficial things about tourism development. Of course, the flip side of that is that it's often seasonal employment. It can often be a struggle for operators, as we just heard, to find kind of appropriate labor pools to kind of extend the seasons, things like that. That's come up a lot in our research with my colleagues and I, and things like that, right? So So labor issues, seasonality, those can be tough, certainly. From the more social and cultural dimension, tourism can actually be quite useful as a lever you can use to protect material culture, to kind of legitimate or find resources for the protection of material culture or intangible heritage. But of course, the flip side of that, as we just heard, is that tendency towards museumification of a community, or you only give resources to the places that are also becoming hot tourist hubs, or that the way you present history and culture then gets filtered through the tourism lens, right? So those can be the drawbacks there. And likewise, from an environmental perspective, which as an environmental sociologist, I'm also particularly interested in my work, I've often heard about how, tourism can work as a space for environmental education, for people to build ecological literacy, right? In some interesting ways, including in the North Atlantic, seeing firsthand some of the effects of climate change as well. Sea level rise, coastal erosion, melting of glaciers, if we're thinking about Iceland or Norway, for example. But on the flip side, tourism is carbon intensive. That's often an elephant in the room, especially in rural and remote communities. Air travel is carbon intensive. When you get to many of our communities, especially rural places, it's very hard to get around without a private rental car often, right? And so bus tours can pick up some of that, but it's often very automobile kind of dependent as well, right? So they all kind of have their pluses and negatives. And I think that's where, one of the biggest messages I'd like to hammer home on these days is the importance of tourism governance. We tend to not think about managing tourism development until the problems start to show up, until you start to see the issues of over-tourism, whether those are ecological issues of, trail erosion on hiking trails, or, over harassment of wildlife, things like that, or the social issues of displacement of town centers or housing. It tends to be very reactive. Governments and tourism promotion organizations tend to put most of their resources into promotion and marketing, until the point where you have a boom and you start to see some of the negative impacts, which within my current work, I would say Iceland is probably an excellent example of, where they've had a boom that they're now starting to have to grapple with problems of. Lofoten Islands in northern Norway and the Norwegian Arctic. Similarly, they've been seeing their tourism numbers really boom in recent years. So they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we manage these problems now that they're showing up? I think it's the approach that we've tended to have in cold water islands is promotion and marketing first. And then once some problems show up, then we figure out what to do with them. But I would argue that we need to have tourism governance and promotion and marketing a little more hand in hand, a little more working in parallel, so that we're thinking about what kinds of tourism we want for our communities, what kinds of numbers are sustainable, as well as we're telling everybody to come here, right? So I guess that would be some of the big picture themes I would argue as kind of a sociologist looking at this stuff. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. We're going to open up to the floor in a minute. So Boyan or Justin, do we have a mic for the, yep. But then before we do that, Jerry, you had the misfortune of going first. So anything Jane or Mark said that you'd want to add to or qualify? Or?
Yeah, I could. Yeah. Well, it's my nature.
Well, I figured, yeah.
I'm a contrarian as well, just by my very nature.
We're going to never reach consensus here today.
No, there's what you're saying. There's a lot of truth in what you're saying. There's no question about that. But if you look at it from Newfoundland's context, we are a place with 500,000 people spread out over like about 800 communities. The fishing industry, you talk about boom and bust. I mean, tourism industry, yeah, it's a boom and bust. It's like every season you're up and you're down, and we're trying to grow the season so it becomes more sustainable over a longer period of time. But in my, and I've been in industrial background for my whole 40 years, and it is devastating when you have a community with an industry with 500 or 1,000 people working, and it goes, or a mining town disappears, and the fishing industry collapses, and places like Newfoundland where we have all these small communities are now their entire livelihood is at risk, and then they have to start urbanizing and coming in or going on government assistance or leaving their home, their birthright, and going to other places because of that. So even though the tourism industry, yes, it's boom and bust, but our goal is to become sustainable, and we are going to work with all the operators. And I'm with the Destination Management Organization. This is what we do. There's 5 in the province where we sit down and we look at the long-term objectives for tourism, how we're going to get there, and the primary engine. We have to remember that unless we're going to get money from the federal government or something. We have to be our own. We have to be our own keepers. We have to generate our own revenue. So great to have an over tourism problem. It's a long ways. We got a long ways to go before we have that problem, in my opinion. Like I would love. I mean, the positive side of climate change. Everything has a positive. I mean, palm trees growing in Newfoundland. Then we have a tourism over problem. 300 million North Americans coming up to Newfoundland for tourism. Now we got a problem. Right now, our problem is trying to satisfy our deficit in the problems. Our budget costs are off the charts. And if we can find tourism, even if it's now only 3 months of the year, and then it grows to 4 months of the year and 5 months of the year, then I think that's a much better problem than having towns completely obliterated and ways of life lost forever, regardless of the heritage and that's where I come from. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say, just to clarify, I mean, I wouldn't argue against any of that. I think to my main pitch for why we want tourism governance hand in hand is so that we better leverage the positives while mitigating the negatives. Sure. That's what I would argue. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Jane, you've had a chance to hear both these characters. Any final thoughts before we open it up? You are stuck in the middle. I will note that.
I think like a lot of things, I think tourism is problematic when we think about it and we plan for it and we develop policy for it in a silo. And that perhaps what we really need to be thinking about is community development and community economic development, and tourism as one pillar in community economic development. And because, I think that when we think only about tourism and not about the rest of community, then eventually down the road we're going to have problems.
I see far too much nodding of heads at the front table, so we're going to open it up to the floor and try to cause some trouble here now. Justin has a mic. He will bring to whoever puts their hand up. There we go, up here at the front. And you can introduce yourself and say where you're from. And remember, the mic is for people online, and you still need to project for people in the room. And Boyan, did you have some other note there? Nope. Okay, we're good.
Hello. Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Professor Carmen Rubio from the University of La Laguna, Tenerife Island, the Canary Islands. First of all, thank you for the panel, because it has been really interesting seeing how the economy is being diversified. This morning we were at the Marine Institute in Holyrood, and in both cases, in both panels or visits, we have seen how the university has been in the center of these two economic development or regional development. So first of all, as a professor in a university, I'm very glad to share this view, how the university is the catalyst next to all the other stakeholders in the region. As a citizen from a very, very important touristic destination in Europe, I would say the number one destination in Europe, where 2 million citizens receive 20 million tourists a year. So that has made us live along our lives with a challenge and an opportunity. So obviously we have used our weather and our 365 days a year of welcoming tourists as a way to change the management and the vision that we have on the tourism that we receive. So I'm very glad we share all of your views. And the question as a professor is, as a university, as a higher education institution, in some cases, our industries, companies, hotels, any other enterprise ask us to provide them with a workforce able to manage and help them provide that those services that the tourism require. And so in this case, how is Memorial University important for you to provide you with those workforce, not only in those high skills, but also those soft skills that your people need? I think, for example, we have a master program program, a PhD program in management of patrimony or heritage, which for us is very important. We have national parks also, so we have to have experts that manage and provide good services in that sense. And our hotels and management needs those students. So we have sometimes the society saying the university needs to adapt to what we need, intelligent tourist destinations, any other. So are you joining together your efforts? I guess so, because you are aligning your strategies, and I am very happy to have seen along the day this happen. But I would like to know your, not you because you're a professor, but what's the what's the opinion of the two other panelists as how is the university important for providing that working force for you?
Thank you, Carmen. And I should say to Jerry and Jane, we're all friends. We know we have an important role, but also feel free to be critical. And if there's gaps, I know Jerry will do that. But no, all of the above. Who'd like to go first? Jane?
I'll go first. So the organization that I volunteer with and I serve on the board of directors, the Colony of Avalon Foundation in Ferryland, by happy coincidence this year, they were the recipient of Memorial University's President's Award in Community University Engagement. And for the past 27 years, Memorial University's Department of Archaeology has partnered with the Colony of Avalon to provide the archaeological research, both the supervision and the student crews that have allowed ongoing excavations to continue at the Colony of Avalon. So that research would never have happened without Memorial University's support. In fact, we can't even get a permit to dig without a professional archaeologist. So, but the other thing is that it makes research possible, but it also improves the appeal of our tourist product. We did a comprehensive visitor survey about 2 years ago, and the number one factor of determining the satisfaction level that visitors had with their visit was whether or not they had a one-on-one encounter with an archaeologist. And if they spoke to an archaeologist, that was guaranteed that they would, out of a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being highest, they would score an 8 or higher in terms of visitor satisfaction. And so, I mean, there's a perfect example of it. It impacts the bottom line, but it also impacts the heritage side of things.
Jane, it might be useful before you hand over the mic. Sorry, Jerry. Just for people who don't know, just say a minute on what Ferryland is all about.
Sorry. So the Colony of Avalon is, it preserves the remains of George Calvert's 1621 Colony of Avalon. And today it's recognized as one of the best preserved early English colonial sites in North America. And the Colony of Avalon is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the first documented place of religious tolerance in North America. So Calvert was a Catholic in a time when in Great Britain you could be imprisoned and put to death for being a Catholic. So he had reasons for wanting to bring himself and other Catholics to North America to find a place where he could worship in peace. But unlike the Pilgrims who went to Massachusetts, Calvert also welcomed Protestants. And so he opened up his mansion house on Sundays, and he allowed Catholics and Protestants to both use his property as a place of worship on Sundays. And so there's both documentary evidence and archaeological evidence that shows that it was a place of religious tolerance. The other really interesting thing is that after a few years, George Calvert found Newfoundland, not surprisingly, a little bit too cold. And so he hightailed it down to Maryland, where it was significantly warmer. But he was replaced by David and Sarah Kirk as the proprietors of the colony. And after David Kirk's death, Sarah Kirk took over the colony. Her husband left her in over $1 million worth of debt. But within 3 years, she had cleared the debt, and she grew the Colony of Avalon to be one of the most successful colonial enterprises in North America. And she is considered one of the first, if not the first, female entrepreneurs in North America. So it's an interesting site, both in terms of just the wealth of archaeology. There's been over 2 million artifacts recovered, but also in terms of what it says about the early history of Newfoundland.
Thank you, Jane. I thought that'd be important to capture that. Jerry, what do
Yeah.
you think of the university?
Well, I think she was the first off. She was a person I admire. So,
There you go.
and I'm probably one of the few capitalists in the room. Anyway. Yeah, so that,
Put up your hand if you think you're
so,
a capitalist.
do I need to talk or
You're on your own,
don't
Jerry.
don't throw anything, please. But yeah, I find the university and the college, of course, very instrumental in the development and growth not only of the tourism industry, but any industry. I think the tourism industry, we don't have that kind of a critical mass where you have the kind of problem you have at the Canary Islands. And by the way, welcome. But I remember when I was in the oil and gas sector, we worked with, as an example, we worked with the School of Business. And because we had the problem with skilled labor and all the different trades in the oil and gas industry, with everybody getting gray hair like Gordon and myself. And it was a real problem. So we worked strategically with the university, with the college, with governments and so on to identify what the challenges are, to try to see what is going to be required 5, 10, and 20 years down the road, and try to implement a system that allowed us to maximize the outputs of the colleges and universities to meet that challenge. We looked at a program like in engineering. My background is engineering. There's a thing called like just-in-time inventory, just-in-time management, and so on. And there are these control systems in electronics and in engineering where you can predict using mathematical formulas and algorithms to what, like for example, you can go to your thermostat and turn it up to 50 degrees and it'll kick in at 45 and kick out at 65, and or you can go with these sophisticated algorithms and you can predict what's going to happen to within fractions of a degree. So if you take those engineering principles and techniques over into this side of things, and you look at what large projects are coming down the tubes, and you look at it on a global basis, then you can actually start coordinating on a global basis, not just in a local basis, but on a global basis, so that you have just the right workforce at just the right time. And so there's a lot of work needs to be done on that, and there's a lot of sophistication in software development and so on. But I think in the end, if we start working with universities and looking at doing the same things in the physical world that we do in the electronics world and so on, I think we can do some pretty amazing things working with universities and colleges.
Thank you, Jerry. Boyan has a question that's been emailed in.
I actually have a lot of questions because Laurie Brinklow, our friend from UPI, has a room full of people over there. But we'll start with Kim Crosby because she asked the first question.
Okay.
Wondering if there are any trends on where tourists originate from when it comes to visiting the non-hotspots in more rural areas. Is there any insight as to whether they tend to be local from Newfoundland or out-of-province visitors?
Non-hotspot visitations. Mark, any thoughts on that? Grab the mic there.
I actually, EDMO might have better data on that than I do, or Hospitality NL. But my sense just from interviews and from field work is that we're probably seeing a bit of a shift. So when I started doing this about around 2009, 2010, I think within province tourism and kind of Ontario, particularly central Canada, seem to be by far the biggest markets in general. And my sense, and I don't have the data to back this up other than more qualitative interview data, is certainly that the American market seems to be expanding quite a bit. I think it also seems like we're seeing more of the kind of the UK market, but I don't know that they're not. I would still probably argue not as big as the Canadian or provincial market, but do seem to be where we're seeing some notable growth. Around the North Atlantic in general, there's a real boom in Chinese tourist travel to the north, to places like Iceland, to Norway. I don't think we've captured a lot of that yet. I think that's something that there would still potentially be a lot of potential or work to do compared to some of our other colleagues across the North Atlantic where I've been working and interviewing and doing that kind of field work. Yeah.
Thanks, Mark. Jane, anything on that?
I think Kathy Stacey's here from the EDMO, so she'll know the numbers better than I will. But I think the last reports that I saw from the provincial government word that resident tourists, so Newfoundlanders and Labradorians traveling around the province, still account for about 80%, Kathy, of total tourism in the province. And then the next highest is, I think it's Ontario. So, and that has the split between resident and non-resident non-resident is steadily increasing, but it is still primarily resident visitors. In terms of out of the way locations, it really depends on the location. Like, for example, Fogo is not going to be the same as Dildo, and it really depends on their product offering, you know, and how well they're able to communicate their message. I can tell you from the Colony of Avalon that their split is almost 50-50, resident, non-resident, but interestingly, I think it is 60% of the non-resident visitors who visit the colony say that they travel to the area specifically to visit the colony. So again, I think it really depends on the product offering and the draw of the attractions.
Jerry, this one?
Yeah, I could comment on behalf of my fearless leader, Kathy Stacey, Destination Management Organization CEO, right? Or executive director. But yeah, so of the people that do come to the province, of course, one of the advantages of being an island is that it's also, as difficult as it is to get on it, it's just as difficult and expensive to get off it. And and since our average income is probably lower than most, it's actually harder to get the Newfoundlanders off the island. So we end up getting a significant portion of local resident travel. Of the outside the province, about 85% come from Canada, about 7% come from the United States, 8% from Europe and other places around the world, about 43% come in from the Maritimes, another 40% come in from Ontario, 43% I think is the actual number, and then the rest comes from across Canada. So we and that's growing all the time, and the spend is greater. So like I say, people coming to the province, they come in, they're spending up to 2 weeks. They spend a significant amount of money while they're here. So there's some real opportunities there. But that answer the question?
Yes, sir. You can tell the engineer, he's got the numbers all tip of his tongue. Boyan, how about a question from PEI? Then we'll go back to the room, and then we'll come back.
That's what I was going to suggest. Okay, so the first question, there are 4 questions from PEI. The first question from PEI: do you have any examples of who is doing tourism well on North Atlantic islands?
Mark is very well positioned on that one. But he is in Newfoundland at the moment, so we'll just warn him.
Very political question. Actually, I think, you know, if I'm using tourism, you know, think about the way it contributes to community well-being, places that have more kind of buy-in, where the tourism that's being built up also benefits the community. Probably the really bright points in the province right now would be the kind of hubs like the Bonavista Peninsula, Fogo Island, and certainly Bond Bay and the Gros Morne region, right, where there's kind of kind of cultures of collaboration emerging, where what's being built up for tourism also creates amenities for residents and for communities, which, as I guess the sociologist in the room, I would say is kind of what I look at as an example of success, right? Like creating kind of more livable communities through tourism. And so I think all 3 of those kind of stand out as highlights. If I think about where I've kind of been doing work more broadly around the North Atlantic, certainly Iceland is always a fascinating example because they've really had the boom that's brought both positives and negatives that they're grappling with. And I've had some really interesting conversations with community leaders and participants up around Húsavík and Akureyri in the north coast of Iceland, which is a more rural, more remote area, more rural communities compared to the capital region. And they've also been doing some really, really fascinating stuff with a lot of community buy-in that's really contributing to creating also more livable communities that then becomes, better suited to retaining young folks, or if young folks move out to get education, keeping the desire to move back if you know you have a happening community, right? That's seen as a place that's valued and valuable to move back to, that's vibrant, right? So if I was looking outside the island, I'd say that would be one place that sticks in my mind as a really great positive example of leveraging tourism to create really vibrant communities. Yeah.
Jane or Jerry want to weigh in on this one? Or
Yeah, I just concur with Mark. I think the point about places like Fogo and the Bonavista Peninsula, particularly Bonavista itself, is that they've taken a community-first approach to tourism. So if you talk to them, they will say that they're not developing a tourism industry, they are doing community development. And so the idea is that if you create great places to live, if you engage in activities that have community support, then people will see that as authentic. I mean, and if you ask visitors what the number one thing that they're looking for in tourism, it's authenticity. But how do we define authenticity? It's our communities buying into it. I mean, I think, when all of us travel, where do we want to eat? Do we want to eat in the tourist spot, or do we want to eat where all the locals are lined up? We want to go where the locals are going. And so I think the community first approach has really proven to be successful in Newfoundland.
Jerry.
Well, I'm like Jerry Maguire, show me the money kind of guy, and not to be flippant about that, we are taking lessons learned from other areas. When what we're looking at on the Trinity Bay south side is very much like Trinity Bay north side. So they've got 25 or 30 years perfecting where they are and getting into this community development. We just need to get to a critical mass where we can actually do that kind of planning as well. But if you take it, I'm not sure who's doing the best, but if you take it from Newfoundland perspective, or Newfoundland Labrador perspective, it took us 500 years to get to $700 million in tourism revenues. And last year, 8 years later, we've jumped to 1.1 billion. So we've had a significant growth in a very short period of time, driven mostly by the economy on the negative side, the collapse of the fishing industry, but on the positive side, the growth in the oil and gas industry, which allowed revenues to be, people to generate more money. So, it's hard to say, but yeah, I think we've done fairly well, and it depends on what our next vision 2025 is going to be. But if we stay on this path, I mean, I think, and we learn from Norway and Iceland and the Canary Islands and the universities and the colleges, and we put all that together in a proper way, then I think we can become a significant example for the world like Iceland is becoming now.
Thank you, Jerry. Another question or comment from the room? We have a couple. So what I'm going to do is get a couple of questions. I'll let Boyan read another question or two from PEI. This is going to be very skill testing for the panel. And then I'm going to let the panel, starting with Mark, answer any of them they'd like to, and that'll be your closing comments. So first question from the floor.
Hi, I'm from here in Memorial University, and I just wanted to ask you, going back to what Mark had mentioned about being proactive, what you think about cruise tourism, because I know it's huge in all of the islands. And I lived in the north of Iceland for a year in an area where, kind of similar to what you were saying about the Canary Islands, the population was less than 2,000, and we had a cruise ship showing up every week, offloading at least 5,000 people into a really small area. And it definitely had some benefits, but I think in a lot of areas now that it's becoming more about finding those remote, untouched areas, the negative consequences are becoming pretty large.
Thank you. And the mic over. I think we have another question over here.
Thank you. I'm from the University of Corsica, overall from Corsica, and I was wondering, do you think the growth of the tourism economy around here could cause the cost of life to rise for locals? And if so, do you think the overall income generated by tourism could benefit the whole community, of if you should expect to see difficulties with the potential rise of the prices, for instance?
Thank you. Any others in the room? Some lined up in PEI. Boyan, Oh, one at the back, and then Justin, you can come up to Boyan.
Hi, my name is Kathy Stacy. And my name's been thrown out a couple of times, so I kind of thought I might want to make a comment. I'm the executive director of Legendary Coast, which is a destination management organization for tourism that represents the eastern portion of the island of Newfoundland. So there are 5 DMOs in the province, and Jerry is a member of our board of directors, and we represent an area that covers about 720 tourism operators, which represents about maybe 650 tourism operators, representing about 720 businesses and services and attractions in the region. So from the Bonavista Peninsula, Byrne Peninsula, and the Avalon outside of the Greater St. John's area is what we cover. I just want to make a few comments. I don't necessarily have questions, but I want to make a couple of comments and just something for the audience. We are the island of Newfoundland, of course, and we're in a very unique situation in terms of we also have other islands off our island. One of them being a foreign country, a European country, Saint-Pierre-Miquelon. So there are 3 islands that are, an archipelago just off our shores, about 45-minute ferry ride, that are French. They're basically a French territory. And we have partnered with them to create, to support one another in our tourism efforts in terms of a combined tourism destination. So if you're coming to Newfoundland and Labrador and you're making that trip, and you want to take a side trip to a European country, there's an opportunity to do that. Same way with if you're coming into Saint-Pierre-Miquelon and you're flying in there, because they also have a direct flight now from Paris, France, to Saint-Pierre-Miquelon. I think there's going to be 12 flights or something this year. But there's an opportunity there's a unique opportunity certainly in Canada, where we have a foreign country just off our shore. So for Newfoundland and Labrador, we look at it as an opportunity to be able to create a unique destination as a combination of maybe the Byrne Peninsula and Saint-Pierre-Miquelon. There are benefits and linkages of history with unique cultures that we can certainly take advantage of. The other thing I want to comment on is, well, I have 1 minute. Okay, sorry. The other thing is I definitely agree with Jane when she talks about we need to be really looking at community and economic development, business development when we talk about tourism. We certainly do. It is from working with individuals and businesses and volunteers and community organizations. It is about relationship building. It is about sharing of resources. It is about working with people and building those relationships and understanding the challenges on the ground. So that's one of the things that we as an organization try to do. I also want to say that it is important, and our DMO is certainly open to this. We do need to be working with our university and colleges and institutions. We definitely do. And I'd like to see more of that in terms of our own destination management organization and those across the province. So that's it for me. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to Carbonear and to this beautiful building. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Justin will bring the mic up to Boyan to plug into Prince Edward Island. Tourism over there, of course, is not very well developed, so they'll be looking for all the advice they can get. Joke, Laurie, joke.
So maybe what I'll do, I'll ask the 3rd question because it dovetails nicely with Jess's question, and then maybe we can do the other 2 after that because they're kind of separate. We have time. It's 2:12.
Okay.
Does Mark have any comments about how Iceland and Northern Norway are dealing with a huge influx of tourists and the problems that come with them?
So I was saving up questions for the panel to do all at the end, but
Okay.
maybe that's very specific. So maybe a quick answer on that one.
Sure. I think Iceland is really grappling with it. And one of the big problems there is the vast majority of most bed nights with Icelandic tourism. So it's been growing like crazy, like up to 20% a year over the last 6 or so years, right? 5 or 6 years. And one of the big problems is most of those bed nights are in Reykjavik and the capital region. And that's also created huge issues of displacement of housing from the downtown core because of Airbnbs and all that kind of stuff. So I think one of the biggest things they're grappling with, which I think also gets to what Jane was saying earlier, is how to get people out, to get them out to other parts of the country, to diffuse what should be positive impacts in terms of the flows of people, the flows of money. So really it's about not saying, okay, we need to limit the numbers, we need to stop people from coming in, but how do you convince them to get, land in Reykjavik and just keep moving, right, more, so that the rural parts of the country, smaller communities see more of the benefits, and then the negative impacts aren't all concentrated in one place as well, right? So you see less of the negative impacts. So I think since I first did field work there, which was a couple of years ago, I went back just last month for Arctic Circle conference, and they have evolved at the national level a tourism policy now. So it went from 2 years ago saying, holy crap, we really need to do something about this, to now at the national level, they are articulating policy now. They're trying to make the governance piece catch up to the promotion piece. Yeah. And I would say similar is happening with Lofoten Islands in northern Norway. Although there, the governance piece is much more localized. It's much less still, I think, a national conversation, because, I mean, Norway is one of the most expensive countries to travel in, which means that, it's really regionalized, right? Bergen gets a lot of people, Lofoten gets a lot of people, but overall the country is not a major tourism destination. So there it's been grappling with it more a bit at the local level. But again, it's that, how do we close the barn door after the horse is left, that after the problems show up. But I think they're thinking along similar lines, certainly. Yeah.
So last two questions, and then closing answers or comments by the panel.
Okay. How do arts and culture relate to tourism? Do the same principles Jane mentioned before apply? And the last one is for Mark. Any takeaways about the research project on Fog Island?
So we did have an early question on cruise, and then we had one on benefits for the whole community, which I think has been a theme throughout. So Mark, your closing 1 minute.
All right. So I'll speak to the cruise ship question, because the Fogo Island project, we have a recent Memorial Presents that's available online now, where the lead of that project, Natalie Swinski, Blair Windsor, Diane Hodgins, they did a wonderful job last weekend. So go watch that for the Fogo Island answers. But on the cruise ship question, it's interesting because in most of the work I do, people have a pretty positive view of tourism overall. There's very few parts of tourism that people are very critical of, but cruise ship tourism is much more contested. It's the part that you start to see much more divergent opinions, much more polarized opinions, partly because often the cruise sector, the revenues and impacts of that are very narrow. They tend to go to very few operators or places. Often people get off the cruise ship and go straight to the chain restaurant that's in the harbor. So I've, just in terms of research data around the North Atlantic, you'll hear way more negative comment and critique about the cruise sector than about other forms of tourism that tend to be much more unanimously supported, much of which I'm quite sympathetic to, and I think there's much good grounding in. But the reason I wanted to answer that question is because the Port of Bergen just recently announced that they're not allowing in any non-electric cruise ships into their harbor as of 2024. So they've taken a very strong proactive step at saying, what kind of tourism do we want? We don't any longer want fossil fuel-based cruise ships coming into port. And, my sense is that means basically they're fine with the idea that they're voluntarily cutting down their cruise traffic to get a kind of cruise traffic they see as more compatible with their community, which I think is a very, very, and the story on that was kind of floating around the Guardian, BBC and stuff a week or two ago, if you're interested in that. I thought that was a very interesting example of doing something that in the short term might cost numbers and revenues, but in the long term cultivates what kind of tourism do we want as a community. So I would leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mark. Over to Jane, closing answers or comments.
I'll take the question from the gentleman from Corsica, and then also the one online about the role of heritage and culture. I guess both of them relate to the issue of community, and I guess I'll just reiterate that I think that that community should never be subservient to tourism. That tourism should always be used as a pillar for community development, and I think that that your comments about the detrimental impact that tourism can have on community, I think we've seen those in parts of the province. I live on the southern Avalon, and increasingly a lot of the oceanfront property is being bought up by people who don't live here year round, who often only come here for a couple months a year. And that's great. They buy real estate, they develop it. But when they're not here, they're not serving in nonprofit organizations. They're not running for council. Most of them don't even pay half the taxes or the garbage collection fees. And so really, even though they're here, they're not adding value to the communities that they reside in during the summer months. So it is a real challenge. And in terms of heritage and the arts, as I said before, heritage, defining and identifying significance and preserving heritage is a community practice. No one person preserves heritage. It takes an entire community to pitch in and do it together. And if that community is gone, then the heritage is gone as well. So again, I just think it just both the answers to both of those questions just undermine the fact that it should be community first.
And the last word goes to Jerry. Dangerous thing.
Indeed. So I understand what you're saying. Like, shame on Norway, believe it or not, in my opinion. It's an oil-based economy, polluting the rest of the world. Major export. They'd be bankrupt without oil and gas, bankrupt without it. And here they are trying to teach the world how to live without oil and gas. Right? It's like, there's an oxymoron for you to begin with, number one. Number two is, I think we, especially here in my experience, and I've lived across Canada, down the States, all over the place. What we have here in Newfoundland, which makes us a little bit maybe more unique, is this true sense of community. We have it. I mean, we're out there on Trinity Bay, and we're working with the local fishermen, with the local artists, and the local musicians, and we're generating and we're reviving a culture, and we're reestablishing communities, and we're doing all those sorts of things in a very, very positive way. We have a long ways to go before tourism is our enemy in Newfoundland and Labrador. A long ways to go, in my opinion. We have 100,000 miles of coastline, a few cottages along the way. I mean, Newfoundland and Labrador is empty. Nova Scotia is empty. Alberta is empty. Ontario is empty. Right? So we have lots of space and we have lots of that kind of thing. The primary engine has to be generating revenue so we can generate taxes to allow organizations like CBDC, like Destination Management Organization, like ACOA, to be able to give some of that money back to allow us to do the things that you want to do. You cannot help people if you're bankrupt. If you got no money, you can't help people. So you got to find the engine. I agree, you got to do it in a sensible way. You don't come in and destroy the world around you. You come and do it sensibly, but you've got to generate that revenue first in order to be able to help everybody along the way. We're all in it together. And so to try to do stuff when you haven't got the money is a very challenging problem. Let's get some money first, and then let's spread it around. That's my conclusion.
Thank you, Jerry. I think we could go on this theme. I think it's been, Harris Center has done panels for 15 years now. I think this is one of the finest panels we've had. The balance, the perspectives, the knowledge, the audience participation couldn't be better. So really pleased with that. If you really liked it, you can see it again by going on the Harris Center website and viewing it on our Memorial Presents link. If you liked Mark and Jane in particular, less so Jerry, you can go. I only say that. That's a segue. Because Boyan and Rebecca Coho at the Harris Center produce a podcast called Rural Roots, and Roots is spelled R-O-U-T-E-S. And they did a Rural Roots on tourism, and Mark and Jane were interviewed for that. But it would have been even richer with you on there, Jerry. So next time we'll remember that.
If I can just interject, in that episode, we also feature Karin Larsen from the island of Bornholm. So there is another island perspective there.
There you go. Thank you, Boyan. I really want to thank the panelists for a fantastic job. And please join me now in that. And And I do have a little gift, which is a subscription to the Newfoundland Quarterly, which is the oldest journal in Canada, published by Memorial University under public engagement. I really want to thank our conference organizing team and for organizing this session. They've done a bang-up job throughout. And for RETI and our colleagues from around the world. It's been a great experience. We have another day of our conference tomorrow, but it's really important to have these field trips, and to the Stone Jug and their staff who have done an amazing job, and to all our colleagues from the community who have joined us today. So thank you all very much, and to our colleagues viewing online in PEI and around the world. Thanks a million, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.